Good morning. I've got some slides. Basically, I'm going to go back in time a little bit here, but to start with, John already introduced me. I did grow up in South Burlington. I was born in actually Brandon, Vermont. Lived there for about 4 or 5 years until we moved to South Burlington. And I had a neighbor that was a captain on the ferries. I think somebody here, Dave Gear, was somebody Tom Sargent knows. And so he was a next door neighbor. So when I got to be that age when summer jobs were coming around, I said, well, what do you think? And, can I get a job at the ferry? And he said, no problem. Just go down and put, give him my name. And so I was 16 when I started. And I parked cars on the Burlington dock for the first summer, and then I started decking on the ferries. Well, this is still in high school, of course. So I started decking on the ferries in that fall for weekends and after school. I ride my bike down, go to work, because we lived about 3 miles away. So got into UVM, and after I accumulated my 12-month sailing time, which is what was required for your license, I went down and got my license in 1971. So I was kind of in between my sophomore, junior year of college, maybe. And we started out with a 100-ton license, which is what's required to run the small ferries that we had in Enchilada at the time. And then after about, maybe 3 more years, you could accumulate enough time to get your 500-ton license. This is what you're required to have on the Burlington operation, which is, the boats aren't any bigger. They actually take that back. They're bigger, but they did require a bigger license. It's going to get a little confusing because some of our newer ferries are much bigger than the Burlington ferries, but their gross tonnage, which is actually what the measurement for your license is based on, is smaller. In other words, a brand new 220-foot ferry, which is the P-Core and the Cumberland. You'll see some video or some slides of those. They're bigger than all the Burlington boats, but their tonnage is actually 99 gross tons. It gets a little confusing unless you know how the Coast Guard measures tonnage. So it was a way for the industry to create these bigger boats, but use a guy with a smaller license to actually run them. We don't do that currently, but there is a chance down the road that maybe a guy with a 100-ton license could be running one of the biggest ferries in the fleet. But so 1975 came around, and that's when I had time to accumulate enough time to get my 500-ton. So I got my 500-ton in 1975, and I spent my first summer in Grand Isle on the Governor Aiken, which you'll see on the slides here. And then eventually I started in Burlington the next summer, and I pretty much stayed in Burlington for the rest of my stay until I retired in December in 2017. I filled in a few times this year on the Burlington crossing. I did a run in Enchilada a couple days ago. For one of the guys had to go to the doctor, so they called me up in a last minute. And why don't I get started? This is actually this would be the office that I spent the last 30 years or so in. This is the pilot house of the Champlain. A few things that you might be interested in. The steering, of course, this is the wheel, obviously, but this wheel is a backup system to the electric. My hand is on this little controller right here. Now that's the rudder control. It's basically it's an big elevator motor down in the engine room, and the rudders are connected to a big drum of cable. And when you activate that switch, it's hard to see. There's two. On the other side of my hand, there's an identical one. So with this ferry, you can actually you can control both rudders from the same position. So there's one for the bow rudder and my hand is actually on the rudder for the aft rudder. And then there's a switch on the wall. If something happens and you lose for some reason, this system gets old and funky, and sometimes you'll lose your steering, so you have to actually physically steer with a wheel, which in the case of this ferry is pretty labor intensive because it's a mechanical hookup, and that's why the wheel is so big. So, and obviously the compass and these windows are kind of interesting. If you've ever been on the ferry, these windows actually, they're hooked to the top and they're counterweighted, so they actually slide down. So they go down inside the wall, so that when you can open up in the sun, in the warm weather, and you want to get a breeze, you just open up all the windows. Another small thing, if you see this little plaque over here, if you've been on the Ty in Shelburne, you probably saw the same thing. Now because when this boat was originally built back in 1930, and also behind me over there, you see on the wall, there's those two brass handles. Well, those are because this was considered a bell boat. In other words, the captain could control it with the captain had a pair of these. There's a pair of handles here and another pair over here on this side. So as you're coming into the dock, you would actually ring a series of bells, and that would ring down to the engine room, and the engineer, because in the case of this particular ferry when it was built, the engineer controlled the engine, and you had to signal him as to what you wanted. In other words, you want to go head, you want to go astern, you would ring these bells. One bell was half a head, two bells was half astern, and then from there go to jingle and so on up, and that's how you made it go fast or slow. And actually behind me, you can't see it, but this, because it's a double-ended ferry, there was a brass handle that indicated which direction you were going to go in, because in the engine room, the engineer doesn't really know which way is ahead or which way is astern because it's a double-ended ferry. So you'd use this handle to indicate which way you would go, and he would turn the engine based on your signals. And then eventually, I meant to bring a picture of it, but I have the telegraph that came off it, because this boat was in Virginia when it was built, and it ran in Newport News, Hampton Roads area of Virginia. And then it made its way a couple different times. It was up on the James River. But there was a telegraph over here on this side over here, and you've probably seen them in the movies, a big brass handle, and you indicate which speed and direction you wanted to go, and that would ring down in the engine room, and an engineer would change the speed and direction down below. But that's what that is there. Any questions about any of this that people are interested in? Go ahead.
Let me see if I get this straight. There are two rudders, one front and back,
Yeah.
and two propellers.
Yeah. Yeah. In this setup, the original setup was a single engine. There'll be a slide of that in a little bit. There was a single engine that was directly connected to both propeller shafts. So it was like a push-pull arrangement. You'd start the engine with compressed air, and you'd start it one way to go one way, counterclocks to go one way, or clockwise to go one way, and counterclockwise to go back the other way. So when you're making a landing, that's what you had. You had both propellers working, opposite each other. Since that, about 7 or 8 years ago, they converted this into a double-ended ferry with two engines, one for each propeller. I don't want to get too complicated, but that's the way it's set up now. Anything else? I thought it'd be fun to go back. I don't know how far back people go, but these were some of the old billboards back in the day. I believe that one over there, it looks like it was probably up in Grand Isle somewhere, South Hero, because it tells you to turn left. So I think that was in the field just as you get into South Hero. And this one, I'm not sure where this one was, but that course, that's the picture of the Valcour, which is the ferry that was built here on the lake, and they called it the Streamlined Ferry at the time. The power lines might give it away, but I can't quite figure out where that might have been. Now this is before my time, but this is the postcard of that photograph, and these are the original streamlined ferries that were built in the late 30s. Now this is the city of Burlington over here, and the city of Plattsburgh right there. You see the difference being the length of the center trunk where the pilothouse is. And they were built, one was built in 36, and I think the other was built in 37. And they used to run between Burlington, Port Kent, Burlington and Port Kent, or Port Douglas as well. The owner at the time, this was back in the days of Horace Corbin, he owned the ferry company at the time. The steamboats were still around, but because they had been converted into car-carrying ferries at one point, but then when these came along, they didn't need the steamers running cars anymore. This is a close-up of the pilot house of the city of Burlington. I guess you'd call that Art Deco style. This is kind of an interesting, you can see where this is the city of Plattsburgh coming in to Burlington. Now at the time, the dock was actually where the boathouse is now. I don't know if people go back far enough, but the ferry dock was actually at the spot where right just north of what was part of the yacht club at that time. But the fact is, they shot the gap in the breakwater, which today would be, you'd probably lose your license, and, well, if you didn't lose your license, but you'd certainly get a reprimand from the office. But that was kind of an interesting shot. Again, this is the city of Burlington. The reason I included this is this is the city of Burlington after she left the lake. Now, she left the lake sometime in the late 30s, maybe early 40s, and she ended up going to Virginia. Now, I don't know if anybody travels south and goes down towards Williamsburg, Virginia. There's a ferry crossing right there, and it goes from, well, the historic Jamestown is right there, and so this ferry actually is crossing this would be the York River, not the York River, the other river. There's two rivers there. James River, sorry, yep. So this is crossing the James River. It goes over to Scotland on the south shore. But it's still there. As last I knew, it was still there. And they use it as a spare boat. That was as of maybe 4 or 5 years ago when I crossed down there, but it was still tied up there. And they would use it at night on the overnight hours because they could run with fewer people. And so, because they have a couple of really nice ferries there now, but this now it's a backup system, or backup boat for that crossing. This is a kind of a fun old shot. This is actually the King Street Ferry Dock. I believe this is some training. I believe they're loading all this equipment onto the tie to go to Plattsburgh. I think there was, because at the time, the air base wasn't really the air base yet, but there was a fort over there, and they were going over there for some training. So and if you see this building here in the next shot, okay, this is just a picture of the high water on the King Street Ferry Dock in the 50s. So that was the remains of that old building. They tore down that other warehouse, and then, of course, the Valcour tied up. Now, I don't know how far people go. This would be the Roosevelt this was a wooden hull ferry that was built back in the 20s, late 20s, I think 28, somewhere on the Hudson River. And so she ran between the current Grand Isle, Cumberland Head Ferry crossing. And this is the one that was sunk in the late 50s. She was a wooden hull, so she started to get a little funky and punky, I guess, and they actually physically took it out and chopped a hole in the bottom of it, and they scuttled it over on the west shore of the lake, over by Schuyler Island, or Schuyler Island off of Port Kent, just south of Port Kent. But that was, she had little ramps that they drop down and drive off. So it was a pretty basic operation. I included the Chateauguay because the hull of this ferry is still running. This is when she was obviously in the early years in late 1800s, but she currently is now the Mount Washington. I don't know if anybody's been over there, but this is actually the Mount Washington III tour boat that's was the Chateauguay for financial reasons or whatever. The company was trying to figure out what to do with these old ferries, the old steamboats. So they actually cut it up into sections. They basically cut the hull into about 20 pieces, put them on rail cars, and shipped it across over the Green Mountains into New Hampshire, and they put it back together and welded it back up, and so this is now the original hull of the Chateauguay. About probably 20 years ago, it was they thought it was too small, so they actually physically cut this hull in half and stretched it. I don't know if I'm not sure you can find it, but there's about a 20 or 30 foot section right in the middle of it that so they made it much bigger. So this is the remnants of the Chateauguay. I threw this in. This is the Adirondack. This is the first ferry that I actually was a deckhand on for the summer. And of course, this is the picture of leaving or just coming in, of course, to Port Kent. And these cars would date this, maybe mid-50s maybe, or that's a 53, I think, maybe, or something like that. So it didn't change much when I started working on it in the late 60s. But it's sort of fun to see these loaded up with cars now. And again, this was also, in this picture, at this vintage, she was also a telegraph controlled ferry. So this was one of the two engines, because this ferry actually was go back too much, but this is the one that was built in 1913. And she was a steam ferry when she was built. I have a picture. This is what she was. She was originally the South Jacksonville. So she was built in Florida, and she ran on the St. Johns River in South Jacksonville, and that's what she looked like. And then, so this was a diesel engine that was added probably in the 30s, and eventually she started out in Jacksonville. At some point, she made her way into New York City, and she ran well, she wasn't on the Hudson, but she ran in New York City, then also on the Delaware River outside of Philadelphia. But when the ferry company bought her, she was actually on the eastern shore of Maryland. She was part of this is back in the 50s, late 40s, early 50s. And there was no bridge across the Chesapeake Bay at Annapolis yet. So when to get from Baltimore, for instance, to the eastern shore, you took a ferry, and then you had to take another ferry to get over here, another ferry to get over there. But anyway, so this was the original engine, and this was taken out up here in 1970, and then that was replaced with a set of newer engines. And then, and this one, again, was controlled by the engineer. You can't quite tell because this is, in between the two engines, there was a control station for the engineer. So he would get the telegraph signals from the captain, and then he would control the engines. And all this, if you can see the engine, it was one of those old style engines where all the mechanisms for the valve timing is all exposed. So you can just imagine all these valve tappets going up and down, you know, clanging and banging. I stuck this in. This is actually, I can't tell if it was under its own power or not. It looks like it might have been under tow, but you see this, it looks like there's smoke coming out of a stack. So I don't know if in this case, this would have been in the early 50s. In order to get her up here, they had to take that whole second deck off and the pilot houses off. And they somehow managed to fit it all underneath. And then, and that's actually how she coming up through the canal system between Troy, New York, and Whitehall. Again, this is the early years as the Jacksonville, South Jacksonville. I stuck this. This is a Valcour picture. This is, obviously, these cars are dating in the 50s. And that's what it appeared at. She was launched in 1947. This is the only one of our ferries that actually was built here on the lake. And she was built in the Shelburne shipyard. And this was kind of an interesting shot. With the air base coming along, there was some reason they had to move an old, I don't know if it was an old bomber or what it was. Anybody that familiar with any old airplanes, you might be able to tell what that was by the pieces. And this is actually down in Shelburne. This is actually when the hull was launched, and then they eventually took it over. I assume, I don't know where they did the finish work. They had to put the pilot house on and so on. And of course, this is two versions of the same shot, but this would be in the 40s, and this is closer to the vintage when I started working as a deckhand sometime in the 70s with the Champlain going the other way. It's hard to figure this out. I think that photograph over there might be backwards because if you look at the way the mountains are, it's kind of hard to tell, but it's like a backward shot because I think that's Camel's Hump, but I think that might be down in the Lincoln, Mount Abraham area, because it's not Mount Mansfield. So I think if you can imagine that photograph flipped around, it might make it a little more clearer. Whoop. Sorry. Okay, this was the Champlain again. This is, again, probably in the 70s. These are the colors under the original ownership. When I started working for the company, I'll have a picture of we used to call the Three Bears, but this would have been, she had this scenic line on the side and white with yellow trim, and the hull was green. And then this is a picture of it when it was launched back in 1930. This was in Chesapeake, or this is the Chesapeake shipyard in Baltimore, Maryland. Like I said, she became the city of Hampton, so she ran in that southern Chesapeake Bay area between Hampton Roads and Newport News, if people are familiar with that area. And I'm not quite sure if this is after she'd been sold to us and they were starting to take it apart, but you see how they're going to take some of the panels off the side. I don't know if there's engine work or whether this is actually part of the original process, because in order to get these up here on the lake, this is what they had to do to them. So you can imagine now they had to take the pilot house and they took a Sawzall basically of its time and they cut right along that, right above the window line, and they took the pilot house caps off and put those down on the deck, and then and basically they just cut this steel all the way along here and all the way down here. You know, they got a house moving company to come in and lift that whole upper deck up, and then they lowered that right down onto the car deck. And then you can see the pilot house caps. I think there's one right there maybe, and the other. She, because of the way she's set up, they had to push it up with a tug. So this, I'm not exactly sure. This might be coming into the harbor, but that was the ferry company's tug. I think that was the old. We had the Doris Cu way back in its day, before my time anyway. That would have been probably in the late 50s. 58, I believe, is when she was brought up. And then they jacked it back up, put the steel back in. And the ferry company at the time decided they added some steel here. So you'll see there's like a curved steel piece here. And they also wanted to open her up on the side, so when they, you'll see how they just cut big holes in the side. They wanted to make it seem more airy and sleek or whatever, so that's what they did there. And they added these curved steel plates up the side. Now this is in Shelburne. This is getting at the dry dock. So every 5 years, the hull has to be inspected by the Coast Guard. So this was obviously one of the times when she had to be brought out for probably a hull inspection. So I don't know if you've been down to Shelburne Shipyard, but anybody been down there? What this is that whole car. We call this the car. That rolls out on a set of rails. You see right where that is? Okay, there's two rails that go out underwater, and that whole thing slides out into the water. It's like almost like putting your own boat on a trailer. So you back it all the way in to that. They know about how deep it is, so that rolls out to the very end. And you bring the ferry in, and you center it on this little tree here. You see there's a board that goes up with the supports, and then you have to center it from side to side. And you see there's a block right here that's not being used, but all the way down through the side here, there's everywhere. See these vertical white frames? There's a block that's down there, and you crank them in. Can't really see them, but there's cranks up there, and you have to manually crank these in. The blocks come in, and they get underneath the hull in the right spot. And once you've got the block set, then you start, and this whole thing gets hauled up with a big electric motor, and it's got a big heavy chain. I mean, there's chain on it. It's that big around. So this whole car gets pulled up out of the water, and it settles down on those blocks. There's also a set of blocks in the center that the hull's sitting on. So that's how the ferries get hauled out every 5 years. So this is the engine I was talking about earlier. This is the old Fairbanks Morse. This is a big 6-cylinder, and it was what we referred to as a direct reverse 2-cycle engine. So you see that right there? That's the telegraph. So in other words, the captain would ring down on his telegraph, and it would make that. There's a bell inside that housing right there, and it would ring, and it would indicate what speed and direction the captain wanted the engine to go in. So then this is the throttle right here, and that was the directional control. So the engineer would start it one way to go one way, and start it the other way to go the other way, and then he'd speed it up or slow it down with the throttle. And again, this was taken out like about 7 or 8 years ago now, and then this particular engine was taken out, and I don't know where they were hoping to salvage it or at least have it put on a static display somewhere, but I'm not sure what happened with that. And then what they did is they brought in, put in another smaller diesel on this end and another smaller diesel on this end. And they're all directly connected to the pilot house now, so the captain actually controls each engine independently. And so you can use one engine or the other. You use both rudders if you want. You can actually sit there and spin it in its own length if you want. So that's the way this was set up. Now, I don't know how many people used the Enchilada Essex ferry way back in the day. This was the Juniper. She was built in 1945, I believe. She was originally not built as a ferry. She was built for the Pepsi-Cola bottling company in New York City, and she ran Pepsi-Cola products up all around the Manhattan Island and up and down the rivers. And then we bought it, I believe, probably in the late 40s. She came up on the lake, and she ran until about the time I started working as a deckhand. I think she was still running in Charlotte sometime in the mid-60s. I think she was still around 67, Expo 67. That was one of the big years when Montreal had the Expo 67. So the tourist traffic in Burlington and Charlotte was pretty crazy at the time. And it was shortly after that she was retired. Now, she didn't leave the lake. She went to Plattsburgh. I don't know if did anybody go over to Frank Papps used to run a tour boat out of it. He put a little barbecue pit on it, and he put a little bar on it. Well, actually, before he got it, did anybody know Bill Scott? You know, Scott Cranes? Remember the heavy lifting crane business? Bill was killed a few years ago in an accident, but he bought this and put a camper on it, and it sort of became his private yacht. He put some big pusher knees on it because he thought he was gonna start getting into the construction business, and so he was gonna push a barge around and put a camper on it so he could sleep on it if he wanted. And I don't know how much he used it. It was sort of a pipe dream of his, and he never really did a lot with it. But so about the time the Juniper was finishing up, this was one of the first ferries that the owners at the time built. This was built down in Warren, Rhode Island. This is slightly before my time. This is Essex, the original one. And then they started making a whole fleet of these, and we called them the mini boats because that's pretty much what they were. And this was the smallest of the group. I think she was only maybe 60 feet long, maybe 65 feet long, and she was wide enough for 3 cars. So I don't know, she could probably carry, well, 3 in each lane, maybe 9, possibly 9 cars. There's a couple more. Okay, this is one of the first ones I decked on when I was after I worked in Burlington for a couple summers. They said, well, you want to get some time on the small boats because you want to get a license, so you want to go down to Charlotte. So this is the Abnaki, and 2 different versions. She's leaving the dock in Charlotte, and this is tied up on the side. This is basically in the same spot, but just over beside because there were 2 boats running at the time. And so she was in the tie-up slip, and then the other ferry, there's one called the Algonquin, which you'll see. So this, again, they were almost identical to each other. The interesting thing with these boats is the drive setup. The company didn't want to spend a lot of money on engines, and so what they do is run these with one engine. So if you can imagine in the engine room, the engine sat up on the side of if this is the center line of the boat, the engine sat up on a cradle on the side, and coming off of the back of the engine were these 2 was a big drive shaft with timing belts. They were big wide timing belts. You know, timing belts have the notches in them. And the timing belts would run down to another big drum on the end of the shaft that had an air clutch. And the end of the shaft had a drum, and then there was this air clutch mechanism that would grab a hold of the shaft. When you inflated you opened up the air valve with a handle, and it would inflate this airbag, and it would grab a hold of the shaft, and it would make the propeller go. And so you'd engage one of those drums of air clutches to go in one direction, and then when it got near the other side, you had to disengage that one, and then you'd engage the front one. So the forward propeller would spin in reverse and slow you down. So you only had one engine. So if the engine dies, you're sort of dead in the water. But that was a fairly basic system that they ran, and it never failed too often. But once in a while, I had one. Changing the fuel filters, because when you're running these ferries, the captain and the deckhand were basically in charge of everything. So you had to change the oil in the engine, you had to change the oil, the fuel oil filters, all that stuff. So that was that's how you got your hands dirty when you ran these ferries. And these early ones had mechanical steering systems. So the wheel was a cable control. It ran a cable from the pilot house all the way down to the, or actually, I can't remember if it was a shaft. Yeah, it was a chain that went down and it turned to another shaft, but it was all cable out to the rudder. But one of the things you had to remember to do is you had to have, the rudders had locks on them. So when you're ready to go the other way, you had to make sure you spun the wheel and then you push this lever down and lock the rudder. Because if you didn't do that, once you started going the other way, that rudder would just go flying. And you knew you screwed up when you could hear this whirring sound. And that was, you look back and you'd see the steering wheel spinning about 100 miles an hour, And then the rudder would come slamming to a halt, So then you had to stop the boat and crank it back, get it back into the center and lock it. But that was always fun with that one. And there was always those occasions as you're making a landing and you forget to disengage the driving end, and so you go, oh, I'll just slow down. So now you pull up the other clutch, now you got both shafts running. So one's pushing ahead and the other one's pushing the other way. So you're not really doing anything. You're heading for the dock faster than you realize it. And then finally you realize, I'm not slowing down. Oh yeah, that's right, I gotta shut that other engine off, or disengage that other propeller. But we made a few landings that way that were a little rough. So this is actually leaving, this was up in Grand Isle. This is one of the old slips up in Grand Isle. And then this is actually one of the first that this Mount Mansfield is, she's a little wider ferry. The last two are only, you see they're 3 lanes wide. This one is actually 4 lanes wide. And so she had one lane under the tunnel and then 3 on the other side. And she was about 90 feet long. I think she would carry maybe 18 cars if you packed them just right. So this is one of the first ones that I ran in Charlotte. She's actually still around. She left the lake, I don't want to get into too much detail, but she left the lake in the late 70s, early 80s actually, because the ferry company got a chance to run in Mobile, Alabama. So she eventually went to Mobile and ran down there for a little while. Eventually finished up down there. Again, this was when she was built, she had one engine, same setup, two shafts coming, or 2 separate shafts for each end. And then, but when she left the lake, the current setup, they actually they put 2 engines in. They got rid of the belt system and actually put in 2 engines. This is actually in Charlotte, coming into Charlotte. That cabin, I think, is still there. It's probably hidden by the trees. And this is our old steam crane working over here. They were driving, I think they were probably putting in. See, what happened is this became wider because she was 4 lanes wide. So they had to rearrange the slips because the slips were all made for, 3-lane ferries. So that when this ferry came, they had to make everything wider. Back to this one. This actually ended up in, well, actually they both ended up, sorry. This actually went, when it was sold in 73, this ended up going to Ketchikan, Alaska. Do you know the whole story behind the bridge to nowhere? Do you remember that whole thing where the Ketchikan was going to put a bridge out to an island? And the island is actually an airport in Ketchikan. So this was the first ferry that was sold to Alaska, and they used that to make that gap between Ketchikan village and the island where the airport is. This one, again, like I said, it left the lake. It had got morphed a couple different times, but eventually it was in Philadelphia as a passenger ferry at one time. And then currently she is in Rhode Island. I don't know if anybody knows where Prudence Island is. It's not too far from, actually just down the road from Warren, which is outside of Providence. but she's actually running out to Prudence Island now. And she's in a slightly different configuration, but. Okay, this is the Grand Isle. This was actually the first big ferry that the owners at the time built off the lake. This was built in Tampa. When she was built, she was about 135 feet long, and you know, she was the cat's meow at the time. And of course, this is the pilot house, and this is actually what the pilot house looks like now. It's still the same. But she was also the first ferry we started running year-round in the ice back in the 70s. And she's been modified since. I don't have any newer pictures of her, but she was back in '95, I think she was taken off the lake, and they cut her in half and lengthened it by 40 feet. They took what was happening was the center trunk area was starting to be more and more of a problem with the tractor-trailer business. And so the trucks started getting longer and longer, so it got harder and harder to get them on. So they had to modify the ferry by taking that whole center trunk and moving it over. So now it looks similar to the ones you just saw with you know, like this is the Governor Aiken. And this was the first ferry I actually ran as a 500-ton captain. And this is down in Enchilada. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the Enchilada crossing, that big slide in the Adirondacks outside of Essex. And again, this hasn't changed much since we've got it. Although it was a 500-ton, you needed a 500-ton license to run this boat originally. But to save money, what they did is they basically put in below the hull, or inside the hull, they actually put in what are called tonnage plates, and that's all these steel plates that they put into the compartments. And what it does is when the Coast Guard goes to measure that, you know, volume in order to come up with a gross tonnage, it eliminates that space. So this is actually a 99 gross ton boat now. So you can run this with a 100-ton operator's license, whereas when she was new, she had required a 500-ton license. So it was a way to save money for the owner. These are the original owners. I don't know if anybody remembers any of these guys. This is Lou Evans, Dick Wadhams, and Jim Wolcott. They were this date is wrong here. I believe they bought it in 1948, and then they sold the company to Ray Pecor in 1976. And this was actually taken up on the top of the office on King Street. We call it the knowledge box, but that's well. Now we're getting into the 80s now, because we had started running year-round in the winter of 76, 77. I was telling Tom earlier, the Grand Isle was the first ferry we tried running, because when Ray Pecor bought the company, he was a commuter, and he used to, I don't know if anybody's familiar with the Ray's businesses, but he used to have what we call Ray's Homes. He had a mobile home business on both sides of the lake and up and down the East Coast. And his office was in Plattsburgh. So he was a regular ferry customer. So when he had the opportunity to buy the ferry company, he came to the captains at the time and said, is there a way we can do this year-round? Can we run the ferries through the ice or what? And they said, well, we've never tried, because the three owners previously I just showed you, they always used to get nervous when ice started forming, and so they'd bring the ferries back to Burlington because they were afraid to get frozen out of the harbor and they wouldn't be able to do any maintenance on them. So the captains and engineers at the time said, well, you know, we're just going to keep running until the ice comes, and if we have to shut down, we'll just tie up here, we'll winterize the ferry, and then we'll get going again in the spring. So the winter of 76, 77, that was their first attempt, and it was, if I remember, I was decking at the time, and it was one of the colder winters we'd had in a long time. But we managed to keep going. We would just keep running, and you just broke a channel through the ice. And you know, every day you'd wake up, I'd come down to work and it'd be frozen in, and you'd jiggle one way and wiggle it the other way, and sometimes if you were lucky, you'd have either a log truck or a heavy truck on the dock, and you drive the truck onto the ferry, and then if the driver was cooperative enough, you could get him to drive back and forth across the ferry, and it would actually break the ice, and it would actually, once you got the ice broken, then you could get it, and sometimes you'd have him drive down the ferry, as fast as he wanted to, and then have him slam on the brakes, and when he did, of course, all that weight would shuck, and the ferry would just break free, and that once it got broken free, and you got some momentum going, you could make it across through the ice. It used to, that first trip in the morning, normally it's a 12-minute, 13-minute crossing in normal open water. It would take 45 minutes sometimes to make that trip across in Grand Isle. But that's how we made it through the first winter. And then we did that for a few years, and then we finally built this boat. This is the Plattsburgh. So she's about 180, around 180 feet long. And again, she's laid out the same way. This came from, she was built in Panama City, Florida. And it was the first boat that we really had designed to run in the ice. The hull's a little thicker. Of course, we've converted over to, the first winter we had the Grand Isle, of course, you had the old bronze propellers. And you can just imagine what those look like after running through the ice for, 3 or 4 months. And each blade, all the flukes on the propellers were just bent. And so they had to get her off the run and swap out the propellers. And then we switched over to stainless propellers after that. But, so this is the first one we built to run in the ice. And then, so that was...
How thick will the ice be you're talking about?
Well, it depends on if you're talking about fresh ice or whether you're talking about anchor ice. So we have two different situations where you might get, if you've been running in a channel, there's a channel there somewhere, because because until we ran 24 hours, you didn't know where the channel was. Always, I have another funny shot later, but it would be like a frozen daiquiri almost, but it would be locked back up together. And so you would be breaking through that stuff. But it might be a foot thick, but it was loose. In other words, it's chunky ice. And you could break through that. If it was fresh ice, in other words, if you had an area that you had to go through that was, if it got fresh ice, it was more than maybe 4 or 5 inches, the ferries they wouldn't be able to break through that. But if it had already been broken up, because you'd been through it a number of times the day before, once you broke it up, it would break up, and it would, like I said, it would turn into like a frozen daiquiri. So this is 1988, so this ferry is bigger now. We went a little bit longer. This is about 190, which is almost 200 feet long. Again, this one is built, we switched shipyards. This one was actually built in Houma, Louisiana. And so she was built in Houma, and I actually I had the chance to bring it up from Albany. Let's see, okay. So when we have to do the same thing to get them on the lake, we have to cut them all apart. So these navigation poles all come down. There's bolted flanges there. And when on the Plattsburgh, we hadn't gotten smart enough, but we had to physically cut all this area here with a torch, and then the same thing with the pilot house. You had to cut the steel around the bottom of the pilot house, and it got pretty messy. So when we built this one, you can't quite tell, but there's actually a flange. There's a flange right here and up here. So you literally bolted the compartments together. In other words, you have a series of bolts all the way around the perimeter of the pilot house. You undo all the bolts. It's silicone, so you gotta cut through the silicone. But once you do that, then you pick the pilot house up, bring it down, and then you take the lounge off and you put that down. And what we've had to do is we run them under their own power. So what you do is you get the pilot house down on the deck, like down on this end, for instance, where these cars are, And then we have to run a big umbilical cord, basically, so that you reactivate all electrical systems, so you can get your steering and all your controls. And so that requires a bunch of, in this wall over here on the side, there's an area where they've disconnected all the wiring. And so they just basically run this big umbilical cord, which is made up of probably 100 wires. And it comes over, goes to the pilot house, and you can actually run the ferry. You're actually in the pilot house, and you're steering and running the engines right from the deck. And this is another shot running in the ice. Of course, that's a Hannaford's truck. Back in the day, they used to cross quite a bit with us. And so these would be the ice conditions that ideally you want, because this field of ice here is frozen against the shore all the way around here, and then you see this ice here is more chopped up, so you just kept running back and forth. The tricky part was getting to this position, though, because if the ice didn't cooperate, we had days where it would, again, this would be the next boat built, this is 92, the Vermont, but the ice, if it came in over a period of, say, 4 or 5 days where you had, below zero weather, and because of course it migrates down from the north, you'll get the ice coming down all the time, and it comes down until we get to the ferry crossing, and then, but if you can get all the ice, north and south of where the ferry goes to lock up against the shoreline, then you just make your channel, and you just keep going back and forth in the same spot. But 9 times out of 10, of course, recently we had a couple years where we didn't have any ice, which is fine, except you deal with rough weather. Because when we get the ice, we kind of say, well, now we get a break because we don't have to worry about rough weather. We don't have to worry about, trucks, rolling too much or getting ice on deck, because if you're in a channel, it's just chopped ice and you just keep going back and forth. But, so sometimes you'd have a problem where big sheets of ice would form over 3 or 4 days, and it might get to be, 3 or 4 inches thick. So the north wind would blow them out, and they'd go down the lake one day, but then they'd turn around and come back when the wind shifted to the south. So you'd get these sheets of ice coming in, and they would close the channel right off, so you couldn't go through it. And so that's when you had to. We've developed these different techniques for running in the ice when it's like that, because it's easier if I'll show you the chart, but we do this thing called swapping ends, because these ferries are all double-ended, and what you do is you run out and you turn the boat around backwards and you go across the lake to the other side, and because when you're running in this, when the ice is flowing like that, you're trying to stay parallel to the wind, because you don't want the side pressure. You just want to be able to run in the same direction as the wind. So you basically, by doing the swapping end deal, you can go over and then run downwind, and you get to the other dock, and you swap ends again and go into the dock. But so this boat was built in 92. The idea here is they put a bigger lounge on it, thinking if you're having to run in Burlington, she had a nice lounge that she could run in Burlington. Again, that one was built in Houma, Louisiana as well. And then in 2000, we built another one. This is the Cumberland, and she's the biggest. She has a sister, the Pecor, but this is 220 feet long. And again, the layout's the same way. The pilot house is the same. It's just everything's bigger. Okay, this is a new pilot house. You saw the old pilot house of the Grand Isle with a wheel, but now the ferries are all controlled electronically. These are your 2 steering controls here, and then 2 throttles. Now, this is a newer picture. When this ferry was brought up or built on the lake, at the time, they had fly-by-wire throttles. In other words, they were electronic throttles. And they became a problem because after a while, there might have been an issue because you have this station in the pilot house. Well, if you turn around and go the other way, there's an identical station just like this at the other end of the pilot house. And so you'd have to go from one pilot house or one end of the pilot house to the other to go the other way. And there was on this boat originally, it had a switch. So to activate the throttles at whatever end you're at. And sometimes that switching mechanism got a little funky. And there was one of the captains had a fairly major crash in Grand Isle, probably 10 or 15 years ago now, where the throttle, he didn't have control of the throttles. So he was going, full tilt towards the dock and had no way to slow down. So they ended up putting in they found some of these mechanical throttles. So in other words, underneath the console here, you'll see some chain and some shafts and bars, and those mechanical throttles actually go down and go right to the engine. Any questions on that? These are your rudder angle indicators. This tells you your speed, engine speed over here. And the way these the steering controls work, we call them follow-up systems. In other words, you just move the lever over. Say you want 10 degrees, you move it to 10 degrees. Well, the rudder goes to 10 degrees and stops. You want 20 degrees, you put it at 20 degrees and it stops. So you can kind of preset how you want it if you want to go straight. But you can also, this is another set of controls here. These are called non-follow-up. So it basically works like a switch. You want the rudder to go a little bit. But again, this is the Picor. This came not as a result of it, but people are familiar with we had the Crown Point Bridge ferry system for a little while. Well, this was built because of the revenue, basically, that was created by that job. Now, maybe before I get into any other questions about these ferries? Because what I've done is I put in some slides about an incident that happened back in '75. I don't know if people around that remember the Valcour going aground on Farish Walk. So this gives you a little shot of the Aiken. So the captain put it up on Farish Rock. Luckily, it stayed on the rock. It didn't sink, but this was the process of freeing it up. So we brought the Aiken down from Grand Isle, and they put a crane on it, and there's Bill Scott's crane, actually. So he was lifting the cars off from one end, and this ferry here is the Mount Marcy. This is the one that, one of the ones I ran. She's similar in size to the Mount Mansfield, except they added this over a deck. So she's got a lounge deck and then a pilot house on top. So this is a picture. What we were doing is that we laid down some steel plate right here. And so we were driving the cars off. We could drive the cars off one end, and while we were picking the cars up with the crane on the other end, the idea was they wanted to take the load off as evenly as possible. They didn't want it to get shucked around too much, so we were driving them off one way and picking up with the crane going the other way. And then we'd take them ashore, and that's not, it looks like, the angle's kind of funny, but that's, I think that's Port Kent over there. It looked like it's the wrong angle, but she had a big gash in the bottom right here, and then down in the center, because the way the rock is, there's two points that were fairly close together, and what he did is he managed to go in between those 2 points, and he put a big hole in one side and in the bottom. And it filled up with water, and you can see how the bow is much lower than the stern. And this is actually the day they decided to pull it off. So these guys here are, back in the day when the oil and gasoline were all brought up by tug and barge. So these guys, one of them may have been Port Douglas, which was the air base. You know, there was a jet fuel facility in Port Douglas, which is directly across from Burlington. And I think one may have been in Port Douglas unloading some diesel or jet fuel, and the other one might have been from Plattsburgh because they were bringing fuel up there. So we hired these two guys to help us pull it off. So they were able to get some temporary patches put on the sides where the major holes were, and they pumped out as much water as they could, and then they just started. They could still use the engines on this end because the Valcour was when she was in this accident, she was a double-ended twin screw. In other words, each end of the ferry had two engines, and so the two engines on one end were still usable. So they were backing them up while she was being towed off at the same time. And
Questions.
I'm sorry?
What was the cause of that accident? Why did it happen?
Well,
Another question is, why do you always refer to boats as she?
you know, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I can answer that. The accident basically, this ferry, the captain on the ferry this time, I know it was his first summer. It wasn't his first summer, but he'd been used to running in the other crossings. And I'll show you on a chart. Farish Walk is about a half mile north of the crossing. And on this particular day, when it was going aground, was one of the heavier, strong south winds that we'd had that summer. And as you're going across the lake from Burlington to Port Kent, as you go across, the wind and the wave, the angle of the waves can be such that if you stay on the track, you're gonna be in the trough all the time. You know what I'm talking about? The wave angles, and you sit there and roll all the way across. But you're also getting moved up the lake as well as going across. And the Farish Walk buoy was actually north, because of the way the buoys are designed, they had to find a spot that was maybe 20 or 30 feet deep to anchor the buoys. And the way that rock is, the way this rock is, if the point of this rock, which in the summertime is probably knee deep or maybe up to your thighs, but it drops immediately into about 150 feet of water. So there's no way to put a buoy, south of the obstruction. So the buoy was actually north of the obstruction about, maybe 100 yards or more. And so whether he didn't realize it or he was getting pushed north as well as going west, he got moved over the rock. And the buoy was, it wasn't as big as it could have been. And so it was a little harder to see. But that's the buoy story is the one we're going with. But anyway, this is where she ended up after she got towed off because she started sinking again. Because when they dragged it off the rock, they tore the temporary patches off. And so it got beached over, the Port Kent ferry dock would be over here. So this is that nice sandy beach. This is actually they were getting ready to pull it off. So this is the Mount Marcy again. And in order to fix this, to get it so they could pump it out, they took a huge oak log, probably that big around, maybe 2-3 feet in diameter, put threaded rod through it, and then they put kapok mattresses on those. And they welded pad eyes to the threaded rod. They put the cork, basically what is a huge cork, they lowered that over the side, and they were able to get inside with come-alongs, and they were able to pull that log up against the hull and created a gasket, basically. And then they were able to pump it out, and they got enough water out they could get her to start to float up, and then we used that ferry to pull on it, and that's how we pulled it off. Now this is that same ferry. This is the Mount Marcy back in 1979. A little bit of history. We'd been through one oil embargo already in '73, and So 73 was when they sold that one ferry, went to Alaska, and they didn't buy another ferry right away because they were afraid traffic was going to go out in the dumpster, and it was a tough year in 73. So, but we had another oil embargo in 79. Well, a hurricane came through south of Mobile, Alabama, in the fall of 79, and that was Hurricane Frederick. And if you know anything about Mobile Bay is probably, the city itself sits at the top of a 30-mile bay, and then there's some barrier islands across the Gulf side of the south end of the bay, and there was one called Dolphin Island, and it used to have a causeway that went to a lift span over the intercoastal waterway on the Gulf Coast intercoastal waterway. Well, that causeway, the storm surge wiped out the causeway and did some damage to the lift span. So this little island called Dolphin Island was stranded, and there were quite a few legislatures in Montgomery that had summer homes on Dolphin Island, and now they're stranded. They can't get to their island. So they contacted this guy, and he said, hey, you know anybody that got any ferries for rent? So they got a hold of the ferry company, and of course we'd already had a rough year because of the oil embargo. And they said, well, yeah, we could rent you a ferry for a little while to get going again. So the Mount Marcy is transiting south. She's been taken apart. She's got the pilot house cut off, and she's going through the Champlain Barge Canal on her way to Mobile, Alabama. And I eventually went to Mobile when it got there, and we ran for a little while down there. But one of the problems was that these ferries draw about 7.5 feet of water, and the average depth in Mobile Bay was probably 9 feet. So when we were running down there, you were almost on the bottom all the time because you were so close to the bottom, and the hurricane course changed the configuration of the bottom, and so we were running aground a lot, and we leave the island from the makeshift docks and stuff, and you could actually feel the groundswell, pick the boat up and drop it on the bottom. So we said, I'm not sure I want to do this, So eventually they got it fixed, and they started running again, but it took a while. That happened to be the year 79, of course. In the winter of 80, it was the Winter Olympics came to Plattsburgh, or Lake Placid. So I had a chance to run in the winter in Grand Isle. So I kind of gave up on the Mobile, Alabama thing, and so that was kind of the history there. Another sidelight was this of course was 2009, and this was the bridge being demolished. And then this was they did some pretty amazing work in about a little over 100 days. They were able to construct all these ramps and made 2 slips. And this is on the Vermont side, and there's the monument down there on the New York side. And this is just an old shot of the Port Kent dock back in the days when the old freight house was there and that had been converted. This is the one I was talking about. When the first couple winters we ran, and if it froze over and you didn't know where the channel was, you could get lost. So what we would do is, one year, this didn't last too many years because it was very labor intensive, but physically they made a whole series of these placards, and they take a boring tool, like an ice fisherman's tool, bore a hole, drop it in, pack it full of ice, and they put those along the edge of the channel. So as you're leaving in the morning, you just follow these plaques across the way. And of course, this is the crossing itself, so you can see the ferry route there. And what I was talking about earlier is that when the ice comes in, say you're starting to get ice that moves down the lake in the winter, and it'll make its way down here, and it comes down to here. And what will happen a lot is now, especially, is that I don't know if you've been on the ferry on a rough day, but when you're leaving, when you leave New York on a rough day, you kind of end up going up here and then coming down the shoreline because if you try to go straight across, you end up in a trough, and especially if you've got trucks, log trucks, everything, you start to roll a little bit. So but again, when the ice starts coming in, then you have issues because you don't have any place to go. So what ends up happening is you do this swap ends thing that I was talking about, where you might leave the dock here, turn the boat around, and go across backwards, and then turn the boat around when you get over here and go into the dock. And we would do that in ice conditions and rough weather conditions. But sometimes it's funny, if it's in the evening and you're swapping ends, it happens just about every year. When people have the sensation of going backwards, so we get to the dock and they'll go, well, how do I get my money back? You're on the wrong side of the lake. And no, we're on the wrong. You wanted to go to Plattsburgh, you're in Plattsburgh. But they get confused because they go across backwards. They get confused. They think they're going back to Vermont. But that and the other situation that we do when we're running in these, when ice is forming, because say it's the south wind, and what it'll do is put a lot of pressure on the ice as you're trying to make this turn into the dock here. As you go across, and when you're running in heavy ice like that, the ferry can't turn. You can't get the bow to go to the left if you can't get the stern to go to the right. So as you're going across, you kind of end up just keep pushing into heavier and heavier ice. And so that's why we've started using this swap ends technique, where you actually swap ends, and then when you go across backwards, you kind of scoop by the end of the dock, and you create a little lagoon over here, and you swap ends again and go into the dock. So that's something that, it wasn't new, but that was something we had to do. And this is Burlington now. There's Farish Rock right there. You see that? Where somebody was asking about Farish Rock. Well, that's the slip there. What time is it getting to be? Oh, it is already. Sorry, I didn't mean to keep you. But any questions? That's the end of my...
What was the minimum aircraft for going through the canals?
You had to get down to 15 feet off the water.
Anything over 15 feet, about?
Yeah, you got to take it apart, or like a radar mast.
Did they ever consider bubblers at any of these docks?
Well, we use bubblers in Grand Isle now, in the Grand Isle slip. We have a bubbler system underneath the slip that keeps the ice from forming, or at least keeps it down.
Steve, people might be interested in knowing the Adirondack is the oldest operating ferry in the country.
Yeah, it's the oldest double-ended ferry operating in the country. Yeah. I'm not sure what's going to happen to the Champlain. He's talking about sinking the Champlain. That's one of the reasons I sort of decided maybe it's time to leave. I've been on it for 30 years. I didn't really want to see it on the bottom. I spent most of my time on there. I did quite a few years on the Valcour as well. But the traffic in Burlington is petered down, and it's been tough because I don't know if anybody's familiar with getting to Grand Isle. You know how nice it is now. You can get to Grand Isle from Burlington in half an hour. But how many people remember the old road? You remember, going over the Lamoille River, winding through the sandbar, and it took 45 minutes to get to Grand Isle back in the old days. But,
is it the captain's call to not sail in inclement weather?
I'm sorry? Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I had a couple of winters ago, we had some really ugly conditions. We had the lake had frozen over, but the south wind was picking up, and it was blowing about 40 plus or minus, and the ice started getting pushed north. So all this ice was getting pushed, and then open water was starting to come. As the ice disappeared, it got crushed forward, and when you had winds like that, and then the waves had no place to go, so as these swells were coming, they would get bigger and bigger as it got closer to the ice, because it had no place to release its energy. And we had swells. I mean, I thought maybe I was out in the North Atlantic or something. I mean, a ferry was going down into these waves. And the problem there was you had loose ice floating around. And if you didn't realize it, if you dipped down into the bottom, not the bottom, but if you dipped down below the waves and the green water would come up, you'd have chunks of ice like this, you know, like boulders of ice coming on deck, smacking into cars, you know. It was like, whoa, I guess this would call it a day, you know. That was one of the worst days I remember. It was President's Day about 2 or 3 years ago now.
Captain Bob. Nobody's asked a question yet. Have you ever seen Champ?
Well, when people ask me that on the ferry, I always tell them that I'm not allowed to drink and drive, so that's really he usually shows up after a six-pack, so.
I guess that's answered.